Good evening, and welcome to the New School. My name is Karen Cooney. I'm the director of the Vogue'ologist Center for Art and Politics here at the New School, and delighted to welcome you to a film screening and discussion of a film called Sex in an Epidemic. Tonight, as you all know, is World AIDS Day, which came out of the Day Without Art. And while the Day Without Art was a negative pronouncement, nevertheless, it was more contained than now that we talk of World AIDS Day, and obviously it affects the entire world. So I'm very grateful to three panelists who will join us after the film. Robert Sember, who is an artist, he's also the current Vogue'ologist Center Fellow. Albert Santana Evisu, who was one of the co-curators of an exhibition called Vogue'ology, which closed last night, and of which you've received a poster. And the third speaker is Kevin Trimell Jones, who joins us from Philadelphia, and the three of them will engage in a conversation about the film. Robert really brought the film to the Vogue'ologist Center, and I want to thank him for yet another wonderful gift, really, to the whole university. He has appeared as a fellow in many, many public programs. Robert will also now introduce the film and say a few words. The film itself lasts about 70 minutes, so we'll watch it and then reconvene. And thank you all very much for coming.
I'd like to just put the screening of this film in the context of the work that we have been doing over the past year that I've been here. That culminated in this exhibition, Vogue'ology. The central concern of this project, this year-long project, has been discussing the foundation of an archive for a specific community within New York City. And this has engaged us in many discussions about the importance and value of history, as well as the responsibilities of remembering, especially when we assume the responsibilities of remembering on behalf of others. Jean's film is a really extraordinary example of the assumption of the responsibility of recollection. And in many ways, it is a recollection at two levels. One is a remembering of her own direct experience within the struggle against the AIDS crisis. Jean was, with Greg Bordowitz, one of the founders of the AIDS Video Project at GMHC when it was first established. She and Greg created some of the first and most important and most influential safer sex videos, and were very much a part, as artists, in the process of the development of what is now considered to be a fairly unremarkable practice, which are the practices of safer sex. And the remembering that this film does of the fact that safer sex had to be invented, and that it emerged from the direct encounters with many, many people in this city, is, I think, an incredible lesson to us in the value and the necessity of collective action and collective organizing. So this film is also the recollection, or is the assumption of the responsibility of the recollection for community as well. And these two issues, the translation of experience into a record, into an archive, and the practice of that discipline on behalf of others. And I don't mean others in a general sense, but I mean others in the sense of a very specific, very defined, very precise constituencies involved in very particular struggles. These are the themes that I'd like to sort of announce at this point and hope that we can discuss in some depth once we have had an opportunity to screen this film. Jean is in Berlin today, participating in World AIDS events there, but she and I have been in conversation over the past couple of days, and it is very significant to her that the film is being shown in New York City today, and that it has been shown at the New School. a place that, in her memory and in the memory of many people in the city, was the site for a great deal of struggle and for some of the most influential sort of radical movements within the city. We both sort of lamented in some way the demise of that characteristic of the school, but also very aware through the many conversations we have had with individuals who teach here and who study here, that that spirit remains very much in action through particular events such as this one and particular relationships. So I'm looking forward to us having a conversation about the AIDS crisis, but also more generally about our own lives within the contexts of histories of struggle, and what we may learn from each other tonight to inspire the kinds of radical actions that the future requires. So let's see this film. So I think let's get going. We're going to be really informal. If you want to get up and get some more wine or get some water or something in the midst of this, please go ahead. And I'd actually like us to begin by going around and just kind of introducing ourselves and perhaps acknowledging something in the film that really struck you, something you want to underscore, or if there is a question that, that you would like to sort of bring into the group that we may be able to pick up as we have this conversation. So my name is Robert Sember. I'm a member of Ultra Red, which is an arts collective. This collective actually began about 16 years ago in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, by a group of people who helped to establish the first needle exchange program. And we consider harm reduction the commitment to actually meeting people where they are in their lives, as opposed to demanding that they be something that they're not, as actually the foundational way in which we organize our art practice as well. So we see it as actually foundational to the sort of aesthetic work that we, as a collective, have been doing for a long time. There is an extraordinary amount in this film that I would love to sort of comment on. But one of the things that I want to sort of pose as an idea is actually that the AIDS, even though we are almost 30 years into the sort of formal history of this crisis, the crisis is still just beginning. We are still at the beginning of this epidemic.
Good evening. My name is Tamara Santiago, and I work at the New School. I'm a health educator. But before coming to the New School, I was doing harm reduction in the Bronx and in Puerto Rico, specifically doing syringe exchange with, and working with sex workers and working with people who actively use. And so harm reduction, for me, is not just a practice, but it's a way of life. And so I come with that commitment to the New School, and that's how I approach the work that I do with students. And I think I echo Robert in the sense that what struck me the most of the film is how it's the same freaking crap. You know, that I feel like it's the same struggle. I feel like a lot of the voices that we heard are no longer with us, but those of us that are still around, it's like we're spinning the wheel. It's still there. And so that was frustrating.
My name is David Gitman. I am actually supporting here. I not work in the field, but it's a struggle.
Robert Santana. I currently work at the Latino Commission on AIDS, but I've been doing HIV/AIDS work for over 20 years, and worked at Gay Men's Health Crisis for 15, and been doing this work for a very, very long time. So to see this film is a little bit nostalgic to see many familiar faces, similar conversations, and continual same dialogues that I think we've been having for a very long time. The work I've done is mostly in prevention with youth and young adults, primarily in the house ballroom scene. Ran the House of Latex project for about 13 years, and actually 14 years, and then started my own house, which was the House of Yavisu, and I've been the founder of that house for a long time. So actively in the ballroom scene since 1989, also, and seeing that epidemic in that community, it was also as devastating, and it's also a very silent community that no one really is really aware of all the impact that community has had. So as visible and activism people talk about, there hasn't been so many activism still and around, and I think similar to Robert, reflective about the 30 years that we've been here, dealing with this epidemic, I'm not seeing any significant change.
Hi, I'm Kevin Chamel Jones. I am the founder of the Black LGBT Archivist Society, Philadelphia. It's a group of us trying intently to document the lives of the Black LGBT community, really thinking about the stories that we want to leave behind, how we want to be remembered. Also, I guess in terms of disclosure, my 9 to 5 is as an HIV prevention researcher. I've done public health research probably the last 10 years, and it's all been centered around HIV and HIV prevention. I'm sure that'll come up somewhere down the line. In regards to the film, I couldn't help but think about my current work in terms of designing recruitment strategies in terms of trying to find a safe and effective HIV vaccine. And right now, work with mostly gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. And just thinking how much has not changed. But also thinking a lot has changed. When we think about, no, nothing's changed. No, I'm joking. But I guess I'm very cynical when it comes to a lot of these conversations about HIV prevention, particularly the hats that I wear in terms of representing a system that has probably been the biggest culprit to the spread of HIV, and particularly in many communities that I belong to. And so I have to wear a hat of cynicism when I do this work.
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Claudio. I'm here mostly for support and, of course, my ongoing education about HIV and prevention and things that are associated with that. Of course, I just want to echo the frustration about the fight for HIV prevention, and something that I guess that I can bring forth about the film is just the fact that it's really scary to me to see the numbers of people who who don't know their status, and people who do know their status as well.
I'm Karen Coney, and was struck by the film in many, many ways. One was that within a very short time, I actually thought a lot of progress had been made, and the degree of utter ignorance in 1980 was almost something I couldn't quite comprehend anymore. And then, after 5 or 6 years, there seemed to be this period of stagnation that arrived, and really where things have not changed since. I was also struck by the effectiveness of humor in prevention strategies and how incredibly engaging and wonderful and seductive it was to look at the comics and some of the performances, and how those were so much more powerful than the statistics, as horrifying as they were. I'm a founder of an artist group called Repo History that looks at repossessing history, and actually is no longer active, but did that for many, many years, and the importance of retelling and rephrasing our own histories, I think, cannot be overemphasized.
Well, my name is Tanya Far Young, and I am a student here at the New School. I'm also a same-gender loving woman who was a clergy person. So my concern is, from seeing this footage, the thing that I don't see addressed is how does a faith-based community embrace the concept of HIV and education? Being a person of color, it's not something that's discussed. But in an open and affirming environment in my church, during the service we have screening. So before you even go to the altar, you're gonna go get screened. You know, so how do we have these kind of exchanges where these things that are political, that are in the community, also are embraced by religious-based organizations? You know, some things have been coming up in the Black church, i.e. Eddie Long. There are a lot of things that are happening, and no one wants to talk about it. And I want to know, how can we have this kind of discussion? I wish more people were here. Yvette Flunder, who is my bishop, who is an advocate, City of Refuge, she's been doing the work for over 20-something years. And I mean, she was doing some stuff even like with the medication. You know, if someone died, they didn't tell nobody. They kept that medication so they could distribute that medication. And so we're talking about advocacy here and spirituality, and that's why I'm here, and I'm so excited. So thank you so much.
Good evening to all. My name is Darrell Knights. I currently work at Gay Men's Health Crisis. I am here to support Robert Santana Ivisu. Watching the movie, it took me back a little bit. At one point, I was a little teary-eyed about things that were not being done at that time. It also made me think about things that are not being done currently. It made me wonder, when was the last time somebody laid down in the middle of the street to stop traffic because men are dying, because youth and young adults are dying? And it makes me think, like, things still haven't changed. In all these years, things still have not changed. So where do we go from here? It strikes, before coming here, I was talking to a young man who is a Gay Men's Health Crisis, and we were talking about the movie a couple of years ago, Gay Sex in the 70s, he hadn't seen that. So I promised him that I would get it for him to show him what Christopher Street was back at that time, and how men went down to the piers and they engaged in behaviors and they put themselves at risk. But like I said, nothing has changed, because men are still out there putting themselves at risk.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Tobo. And as I was watching the movie, I kept on tweeting different things that popped out to me, if it was either a phrase or if it was a fact, and people either were replying to it or were adding on to their tweets. And I always like to say that I live in the future. And actually, that's actually my Twitter screen name, The Future. But I think that there are things changing. All day, all my friends, either on Facebook or Twitter, have been going off about condoms or myths or different things on how to educate each other. And I keep on hearing things about, how do you have these conversations? And people are having these conversations. Young people are having these conversations because we have so many ways to communicate now that it's almost like if we're not going to take care of ourselves, then who else will? So I think that there's an ownership within a lot of young, gay youth of color who are taking up the fight. Maybe not in the way of maybe laying in the street. I don't know. I mean, I could try that, but I think it's important to continue educating the future. I think there was a point in the movie, I think, that stood out to me where it was around, do you have to keep on educating people? Shouldn't people already know about HIV? I think was kind of the main message. And you do, working in this field from such a young age, and seeing Arbor and seeing Darrell, people that I look up to in so many ways that started me in this work. But I remember having a conversation once with a young person. He was about 15 years old. I was testing him for HIV at the moment, and the conversation was around him having unprotected sex with his partners and him not knowing that that was a means of him contracting HIV or something that put him at risk. And it just brought me to the space of, well, if he's 15, there are always going to be new 15-year-olds. And every year there'll be somebody who turns 15, and these conversations have to keep on happening. But I think also the history part of it, I think, also has to continue within these conversations. Because I kept on tweeting stuff that I didn't know. Because if I don't know, I'm pretty sure other people my age or younger than me don't know this stuff. So yeah. Thank you.
My name is Emily Shaw, and this was one of the things that I kept thinking about during the film. I was struck by that, I am someone who was born, as I forget the name of the photographer who puts it as like in the time of AIDS. I was born in 1985 in the time of AIDS. Probably around when I became aware of it would probably be about 1990, 1991. And so by that point, I thought of it as, something established that existed. And I grew up, I think I knew what safe sex was before I knew what sex was. Like, I think, which is remarkable, and that is wonderful that I'm one of those children where that type of education worked. Put on your seatbelt when you get in a car, use a condom when you have sex. Like, it's that, there's no discussion, that's just what you do. And so I think it was, I don't think it was even until probably after I graduated college maybe that I started interacting with people my age who didn't know that. I was struck by, this sort of almost like backsliding that we're talking about, that there are young people who are still being infected that don't know. And it never maybe occurred to me that people didn't know. And I think that's just, reprehensible. And that's what I just kept thinking of during the film.
My name is Ricky Price. I'm a PhD student at NSSR, and I'm kind of organizing my research around queer youth homelessness and discrimination against LGBT elders. And one of the things that I really liked about the film was that it showed this continuity, and it wasn't this break that after the cocktail, it wasn't two parts. It was like this continual story, which is, I think, something that is missed a lot. And when I speak to LGBT elders, there's this real palpable sense of anger and rage at youth and at my generation for not having lived through this. And I think it's interesting too, because as a community that's based on your sexual and gender identity, you don't come from a gay family. You don't learn about gay history through a gay family. You don't learn about the AIDS crisis through your mother and father. You learn about it through the community that you join when you come out or when you affirm yourself. And so I really come to this forum seeking the wisdom of this group and how to bridge this generational divide that exists between the people who lived through the epidemic and those of us who've grown up, like you said, in the age of AIDS, where it's been established. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm Howell. I'm also at NSSR in politics. And I share some of the frustrations. I mean, I think one of the things that we had spoken about privately was the sort of lack of cultural or collective memory that a lot of the sort of national broad-based gay activism that's happening, at least in a very public way, this entire presentation is completely absent from that, and I think that's highly problematic. I think that it's important to have this space where we are able to sort of rehash that history and also in an effort to always reach out to 15-year-olds. And it's interesting to me that of those of us, I also was born in '85, and of those of us that have always come of age in the time of AIDS, that I don't know. There seems to be, it's frightening that there seems to be a desensitizing or something about it that makes us move past it into this sort of just equal rights or civil rights language that doesn't acknowledge the. I think there's just a slide that's happened a little too quickly. I mean, I was really, I remember the I remember the Bush administration very well. You know, I mean, this stuff is not ancient knowledge. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that we still have so much bridging to be done between the generations, but also among various people within our own generations. So.
Hi, my name is Leo Jones, and what resonated with me in reference to the film was what I see is the underlying flaw in American society is refusal to deal with the realities of existence on any level. The problem with how we addressed the HIV situation, we just ignored it until we couldn't ignore it anymore. And as a consequence of that, it manifested to the degree that it presently is. And our approach to healthcare is no different than our approach to education, our approach to racism, our approach to discrimination as far as gender is concerned. It's all the same. It's just one aspect of how we deal with things. And until we deal with things on a more forthright basis, I don't see anything changing. I mean, we can extend it to all the talk about our present position in the world and where we would like to be. And we're not being real about that, because at this time, we have real competition in the world. And we still carrying our cultural mythology, which we're excellent at.
My name is Kabir, and I'm an artist. Probably the one thing that interests me, I could think about things that horrify me, such as this notion of an impossible amount of pressure that's being placed on poor communities of color that are being put in prisons, not educated properly, and not given adequate access to health care, as one thing that I can't really escape as a problem that I guess in some sense Mr. Jones is referring to, among other things. I don't see that changing either. But the one thing that I feel positively about is the possibility for individuals to use and create archives and collections of historical resources and contemporary informational resources that can be used by others to create channels or ways in which information about the AIDS health crisis can be, more readily remembered, and it just seems that if people don't create histories, keep trying to create histories about what has happened and what is happening, then there really isn't any hope. At the very least, at a very core level, that seems to be what has to happen, and I don't really have anything else to share.
My name is Alejandra, and I'm a former student at the New School. I am currently working with an organization in Brooklyn, which is one of the hardest hit areas with the HIV pandemic in New York. And when I watched this film, I was surprised that one of the presenters says something about how political HIV and AIDS is of a topic, and how it was kind of dismissed, the whole role that pharmaceuticals have played and the invention of the cocktails have made HIV a forgotten disease, because we're no longer seeing people dying, or we're no longer seeing that visibility. And when I go and do my home visits to clients, and I ride these public buses, and I hear these teenagers talk about the most ridiculous stuff, but they don't ever get exposed to actually like education. There's never posters that talk about HIV in the present times. It is a forgotten disease, and that's so scary, because we now see incidents of older adults getting infected because of Viagra, and now they're having sex, so they're becoming, populations of 55 to 7 years old are becoming infected again. And there's a lot of silence around this. It's an economic issue, it's a political issue. And as a social worker, it's, you feel so powerless sometimes, you know, because you see that it's so much denial, and nobody's putting so much pressure on these pharmaceuticals who are making millions of dollars. I mean, some of these cocktails are $3,000 a month for these people to survive. I have survivors of 25 years who remember the harder times, and they always talk about, you know, the harder times and stuff like that. But there is a little bit of romantic feeling in this film, but I did get some hope as well that people, you know, are out there fighting for what they believe. So let's keep it up.
Hi, I'm Annie Shaw. I'm the senior office assistant at Verilis Center. I'm also an artist, and I think what's actually, I have a very different perspective probably for most of you, because my first encounter with AIDS and issues of AIDS was through Fashion Magazine when I was growing up as a teenager in Hong Kong. I left Hong Kong when I was about 12 and 13, and about that time, same time, I learned about AIDS through two magazines. One was the City magazine, which is a fashion, kind of high-end fashion magazine in Hong Kong. And the other magazine was the Face magazine, which is the British magazine. I think, I'm not sure whether it's still around. It's actually might have ended just recently. It's not, right? I don't think I really understood that AIDS was a crisis until I became a full adult in America. And it was really interesting to see this film because I think in a way it actually added another level of understanding for me now. And I remember associating a lot of ACT UP posters actually with fashion and with Benetton ads and with, you know, and frankly, I think I never completely understood as someone that, you know, as a teenager, and, you know, English was something that I really gradually kind of, I mean, I knew English well, but the contextual meaning of silence equals death, to me, I have to be very frank, at 12-year-old was more closer to like a cool t-shirt than like a skull on a t-shirt than what it really means in this crisis. So that's kind of a very interesting perspective for me to revisit as I'm seeing, you know, this material today.
My name is Elias Imama, and I'm a master's student here in media studies. And I got a lot from the film, particularly how political of a disease it is, and how kind of the movement had shifted. You know, when we got into the 90s and to the 21st century, we saw more women and people of color, and those are a lot of the issues that interest me. I'm also really interested in kind of what's going on in the Black community with these discussions and this kind of men on the down low, how gay men and Black men have been kind of targeted for spreading the disease, and these larger questions of classism and homophobia. The structural issues are kind of being ignored. And I was thinking about Tyler Perry's last movie. And so I'm just really interested in kind of what's going on within the Black community there. So yeah.
Hello, my name is Bruce, and I found the film very, very interesting, and took me back to 1980 when I was a student at Columbia, and the AIDS crisis was first emerging. And a student in one of the policy courses we were taking, which dealt with class, it was a course of Professor Cloward, and it was the New Class War, which didn't happen, unfortunately, or it was lost anyway by the endangered class. And a student, young woman, I wasn't that young even then, said brought up that, well, we're talking about all this, but what is emerging in the very foreseeable future will be this acquired immune deficiency. They didn't call it HIV/AIDS at that time. They kind of differentiated between the virus and the full-blown AIDS and so on. Now it's under HIV/AIDS, from what I can observe. So, and it did happen, and things got progressive, as I recall, having spent my whole work life in public social welfare programs. It got very bad between 86 and 93, at which point they kind of opened the floodgates, as in many other programs, whatever the agendas were, not always positive in behalf of consumer populations, but nonetheless it did improve considerably. But the problem is, from what I see, and I'm out of the work world now for probably 11 years, but things haven't really improved. Well, they have improved, yes, but everything else has gotten worse structurally, socially, and so on. But so probably for the AIDS population, it has gotten better because things are structurally now exist which didn't exist. And but so we'll see what happens.
My name's Justin. I'm a student here at GPIA and focus in global health. I grew up in the late 70s, and I have almost the exact same story. I remember vividly thinking, you know, what was safe sex before I really knew what sex was, and my parents told me when I got older that they used to go in the other room and laugh. They didn't want to laugh at my face. You know, I assumed that, you know, the reason why I couldn't have sex till I was 18 is because you weren't allowed to buy condoms until you were 18. So I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess you just got to wait till you're 18, you know, like, because you have to have condoms to have sex. You know, it just seemed to make sense. And then when I met my friends who didn't have that philosophy or didn't have that upbringing or were already having sex, and I was like, really? You know, I thought that was just like the movies we watched, it was like a joke, like everything was an after-school special. And, you know, nobody really did that, you know. Of course, then I found out later I was just apparently a late bloomer. But, you know, then what I also thought was interesting is my mom was a nurse, and I remember when, you know, she, of course, any medical TV show that was on TV, we'd watch something, and I was old enough to remember watching things on TV, and there would be a nurse, and let's say there was a very obvious stereotypical gay male, you know, receiving some form of medication, and the nurse pokes herself, and she instantly asks him, you know, are you infected? Do you have AIDS? And he doesn't want to answer the question, and she doesn't want to pressure him, but then she starts freaking out. And I remember having a long conversation with my parents trying to understand, you know, multiple components, you know. And my parents told me later that I asked a lot of difficult questions for a young kid, and they really struggled with how to answer them. But I just didn't understand, why wouldn't he tell her? And then why did she assume he was infected? And then how come, well, even if he didn't want to tell her, why couldn't she just find out? Like, the not understanding how much time it took to find out if they were infected, and then all the other things that came along with it. And I guess I thought it was very funny how you phrased it, watching the movie and looking at, you know, wow, things have changed, but things haven't really changed. I have a lot of friends with alternative lifestyles, and when they talk to me about things, I'm instantly taken back watching, you know, whether it's this film or any film, going, I thought we were supposed to have learned from some lessons, you know, where's the education? You know, if somehow, as a heterosexual male, I knew when I was younger what I was supposed to be doing, how come you guys don't know what you're supposed to be doing? Why do we have to keep, like, I'm all for continuing education, but where did we suddenly stop? Like the gentleman that mentioned, you know, you walked into a bar and there was a bowl of condoms, and now the bar is like, wow, you know, we can't supply the condoms. Like, what happened that we suddenly became so complacent with the idea of AIDS that we forgot what was the most important thing about AIDS was the lack of education? You know, how did we suddenly forget that and lose that momentum? So I just thought that that was really great in the movie.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I'm actually going to introduce Shanti. This is Shanti Avagan, who is actually the producer of the film. And it is really fantastic to have you with us tonight. And I really want to hear your sort of reflections on the film in the same way. But I actually want to pose a very specific question, which is, were there discussions in preparation for the film about the need for history, and how you were understanding how to work with history, you and Jean, as you were sort of preparing to actually produce this film? And then I'm also curious to know whether, going through the process with Jean, whether this sort of an understanding about the terms of history developed for you, as a result of actually being a part of building this particular archive.
Hi, I'm Shanti. I was going to just say that I'm happy to hear what everybody has to say, and that I don't really want to talk very much, but I'll respond to the question. But it is, first of all, it was really amazing. I mean, one of my favorite things to do after the long, hard process of making a documentary is to sit in the back of the room and just like see how people respond to different things. And I mean, you forget that things are funny or that things are moving, or because there's so much reworking the footage becomes really overworked, and you just kind of lose perspective. So I really love doing that. And this is even, thank you so much for organizing this in this way, because it's way better than just sitting in the back of the room. I get to actually hear what people thought, and where it's a really diverse and interesting crowd. So I'm happy to be here as well. Jean is in Berlin actually tonight showing the film. Also, there's a lot of screenings happening all over the country, and also in a couple international locations. So she sends her greetings, and she, I don't know, some of you probably know her or where she's coming from, but I think as a way of answering your question also, I should just tell you that Jean Carlomusto has worked on documenting the AIDS crisis, and documenting especially the activist response through ACT UP and lots of the different satellite groups in ACT UP since basically this film starts when she started documenting things, before there was any sense of what was causing the gay cancer. She was already involved in activism and also filming stuff. So your question about history, I mean, Jean is part of that history, and she had been producing and kind of putting together this archive that she used in different ways over the years to make different films. But she was really living with all of this footage and wanted to kind of make a bigger historical piece, something that really showed the arc of what had happened in prevention activism, especially well, actually, she wanted to do an international piece, and I kind of talked her out of it, but that's another story. But we believe it or not, this was like the narrowed down vision of what this film might have been, right? So it's still a huge arc of a story, and there's lots of different pieces that aren't in here, and it's definitely, I mean, when you make a documentary, you choose, sometimes, because of constraints, sometimes because of conviction, but you choose what to include and what not to include, and there's lots of things that aren't here. I came into this project much later than Jean did. I mean, she had this idea for this film probably for the past 15 years. That doesn't mean, she was actively working on this project, but she was thinking about what could fit into this kind of history. I had made a previous film that came out in 2005 called Pills, Profits, Protest, about the international movement for access to medications. And that was a much more, kind of the historical scope of that was much narrower, but it also felt like we were making a history with that project. I mean, for me, that's what documentaries, you're proposing a vision of how things happened and what's related to what, and creating conversations. So I came in to work with this. Jean had seen that film and liked it, and we knew each other kind of socially a little bit before, and I always, I knew about her work, of course. as an AIDS filmmaker. And so she asked me to come in to bring in this international part to this film. And I, after a few conversations, convinced her that that was a mistake. And then I was like, shoot, I just talked myself out of this job or this interesting collaboration because I convinced her that, it shouldn't have this international scope. But we ended up, kind of deciding, we ended up just working together anyway throughout the process. And a lot of the work was archival. I mean, I had to do a lot of kind of maneuvering to get that footage from the UN of Jocelyn Elders. That was probably the hardest piece of archival footage to get our hands on in terms of it was very bureaucratic, and you have to have a broadcast outlet in place for them to really take you seriously. So we had to do I had to make some friends on the inside, and they kind of snuck it out to us. But a lot of the footage was gathered from other activists and also from Jean's own archive. But the vision of history, like I said, making a film is very material. So and I knew that already from making documentaries, that you work with what you have and you try to get things if you really want them, but sometimes you can't. And I think that's how history gets told, right? You try to find out what you can, and it's always kind of incomplete. But the thing that I've liked about showing this film in different places, I've just been to a few screenings so far, but it's really great to see how different generations. I mean, this issue of generations always comes up, and for us working on it, also Jean and I are of different generations, and I think that's so important. Whether it leaves you frustrated and why are we still asking these questions, or why are we still trying to convince people that that condoms won't, that teaching about condoms won't make people want to have sex, and it's so, it seems so basic, right? Why are we still doing that? But it's also, you have to keep doing it. Like someone said, there's always going to be 15-year-olds coming up, and also we forget, adults forget things a lot, and I think it has to be kind of renewed. So I'm going to stop talking, and I again thank you, Robert, for facilitating this conversation.
Pills, Profits, Protest is an absolutely extraordinary film, and I really urge you to obtain a copy and to see it if you can. And one of the things that's very striking to me about it is that it does have this historical depth to it, but it also it uses history in order to actually produce an argument, to produce an analysis, to arrive at an understanding of what has produced the conditions of the present. And this is something I'd like us to potentially sort of focus on a little bit if we can. I'm very struck by the sort of propositions that we've put in place as we've gone around talking about, which is the sense of story, of narrative. And the realization in many ways, as I've been listening to you talking, that the history of the epidemic is ongoing. I mean, the history is in the future in many ways. And that we are, no matter what position we are in relation to it, part of that history, by virtue of actually having seen this film this evening and participating in this conversation in some way. And so it's a particular kind of a relationship to history. It's different from a history of events that actually are in many ways quite closed at this point. This is a history that remains very open, and it is going to be narrated and re-narrated and re-narrated for years to come. And so, the question of the future is a very, very significant one. So that issue of what is the story of AIDS to be in the future is something that I'm hearing a lot in the conversations. But also this image of repetition, and that there's a relationship, a very, very close relationship between the building of a story and then this ongoing act of repetition. The next 15-year-old, the next 15-year-old. But for our own selves, this experience where no matter what position we have in relation to this, a remembering, the nostalgia that you've spoken about, Albert, this ambivalence or this dis-ease and being able to sort of say, well, nothing has changed, but yes, actually things have changed. This, to me, these are indications that we are deeply pulled by the tides of history within the context of this epidemic. And I'm very interested in thinking of history in the way in which we heard structural interventions being presented. This idea that that there are interventions, that there needs to be change at the level of large systems, not just change at the level of individuals. And that in many ways, the capacities of individuals are conditioned by large structures. And that if we want to actually enable individuals to be able to make certain kinds of choices, the structures within which they are living need to be transformed in some way. And what if we were to think of history as also a structure in some way? That history is a story that helps us to understand how things came to be the way in which they are. But that story can be told somewhat differently, all right? Who tells, there's the adage, the victor tells the history, all right? We've been going through decades now of people claiming the histories of otherness, the histories that are concealed, that are silenced in the master narratives of the powerful. And as women, as gay men, as African Americans, as the formerly colonized, and the list goes on, as indigenous populations have actually invested in the construction of these narratives of becoming, so power has shifted in remarkable ways, as have the strategies of struggle shifted in remarkable ways. So I think of history as a very, very important place to situate activism and to think of how those narratives are going to be told. Arbit and Kevin have committed themselves to building archives of very specific constituencies. And this work really sort of has been circulating around the commitments that they have made to the construction of these archives. And I would love to hear the two of you talk about why it is that you, given your long lives within the context of the epidemic, and within the communities and constituencies that you have played a part, have decided at this point to actually begin to take on the responsibilities and the problematics of history.
I think I would start by saying my commitment has been my constant struggle to figure out what else can I do for this community, and what are we doing wrong, and what is the best way that I could convince a young person, I could convince my community to take care of themselves and to communicate and to tell their history. It was interesting for me that for many years, actually, as I became involved in HIV/AIDS work, from being an activist myself and getting arrested too, for a couple of times in my life, and then going into an institution like Gay Men's Health Crisis and being institutionalized in Gay Men's Health Crisis, then seeing an external community like the ballroom community that wasn't institutionalized, what was happening to them and what interventions around HIV we could do. Yet at the time, and I was saying I was a member of this community since '99, it took them a long time to trust me. And I think that, you know, in order to, like Jean's documentary, I think that there's so much of a commitment from Jean to tell this story. It's the same reason I have the commitment to tell my story and to tell the story of my community and begin the archiving history of this community, because I think it's so important to tell the richness of why there is competitions in this community, why we compete, why there are balls, why are there houses, why are there gay families in struggles, why, you know, we pick these families and this lifestyle. Why did I compete? Why did I want to win? Why did I want to become a legend? Why do we become legends? Why do we strive to win? Why do we get angry? You know, all these reasons of why competitions exist always fascinated me as I was in the realm of it all. And I would say as an addict myself to the community, I addicted to it, you know, and its fascination. As I think physically I got sick and developed kidney failure, my interactions were limited. And then my desire for the continuation, or saying, how do I still connect to this community, felt like I needed to still relate something back. And a lot of kids will come back, especially the younger generation of kids who are trying to integrate themselves into a community of competition would say, you know, well, what is Vogue? You know, how has Vogue started? It started with Deshaun from America's Best Dance Crew, and he's the one, you know, America's Best Dance Crew actually did this group called Vogue Evolution, and that's the history. And we just recently heard that in one of our conversations. And that was the beginning of Vogue. No. But in its context, you know, for me, it was a reality for someone to actually say, contextually, history that was their beginning. So that wasn't wrong. It wasn't wrong. But, you know, for people in the scene like myself, was saying, well, there's a little bit more truth to what has happened that evolved to actually having MTV allow us to perform and be gay publicly, you know, much more than that. So my intention was a level of education and a level of communication for the community, as well as people outside to actually have an understanding as to why we exist. And its complexities. It's complexities about gender. I was considered the mother of a house. I'm considered a feminine gay man. And I was, you know, took a role of a parent. And being a parent, you know, it's very complex. And that, you know, is something that needed to be told too. What does that mean to be gay, to be a parent, to be identified as a mother, to deal with that? And I am not the only one. There are so many complex stories in this community. So therefore, I started about 5 or 6 months ago, my oral history project, where I decided to begin to interview friends, family members of the ballroom scene, and allow them to tell their story. And I wanted them to begin to tell us why they're ballroom and what was their lifestyle, how did they grow up, where did they grow up, are they different from Emily? You know, how different are they? You know, what was your lifestyle like? You know, where did you grow up? Where was your lifestyle? What was your family like? Where was, you know, when was your first time you become gay? And then how did you come into the ballroom scene? What was the first category you walked? You know, why? What enticed you about walking that category? Who encouraged you? And then what's your history? What do you know about it? And then, of course, we talked about the epidemic. And do you know about how HIV has affected this community? And for many kids who've been telling their histories, that's one of the hardest set of interview questions that I've asked. And then the future, where do we think we're going from here? You know, and, you know, if you would give an advice to someone in the ballroom scene, what would that be? And then one of the last questions was a very interesting question that if you would see it in the exhibition and brochure, it's a timeline that we created around music and its association that we have around music. And the question was basically, if you knew about the ballroom scene and one particular song about the ballroom scene that stuck to you, what song would that be? And everyone would mention a particular song that's on that timeline. So from Love is the Message, all the way to Dindada's Kevin Aviance's Dindada, to George Grant's Dindada, to Plastic Dreams, series of songs, and they'll tell us what was their connection to it. Oh, that was the best runway song. Or that was the best performance song. Masters at Work, The Ha was the best performance song. And that was what stuck to them. And I thought that it was interesting to kind of see the timeline between the 1970s and at least 2000, or 1999, I think was the last year that some of the songs were being documented till now. So its history is very rich and very important. And I think that communities in and out could actually benefit from learning a little bit about the structure, the struggles, the complexities of gender. And I think it's a parallel for me, and actually is also a parallel for my wanting the community to also understand its own complexities.
So I like to think that my interest in history and my desire to learn more about other people really comes from just my upbringing. I grew up, I was born in 1976, grew up watching Star Trek all the time, you know, with my father. And if you would know anything about Star Trek, it's a group of people going through the planets to learn more about other people. And that was it. At least that's what they said they were trying to do, and it was very problematic. It was very, many different issues when I go back and look at it now. But I'm thankful for it sparking an interest in me in terms of what more can I learn about this particular place? What more can I learn about this particular person? What more can I learn about myself? And so when I think about history, it really is, it's a selfish pursuit. It's a search for myself. I am new to Philadelphia. I shouldn't say that. I guess I've been in Philadelphia about 8 years now. But they remind me that I'm a transplant. And I took the responsibility of being a custodial of history out of that interest of wanting to learn more, wanting to see how this community that I heard so much about growing up, and this being about just queer people, and that term wasn't used in a political sense. It was used mostly derogatory. But I wanted to know about those people because I always felt like I was I was part of that group. I remember clearly in the early 80s. I actually remember the Sunday. I remember what the pastor was wearing. I know what his wife was wearing. I remember her hat. And I remember him saying clearly that gays were going to hell, and if we didn't believe it, turn on the news and see the reports about HIV. And he didn't call it HIV, called it cancer. And you know, if you're black in this room, probably you had somebody die of cancer that wasn't really cancer. It's cancer. But that was just the term that was given to not describe this issue, this silence. It was just another way to silence groups. And so even in church, as that 5, 6, 7, eventually 8, 10, 13, 24-year-old person, hearing the same message about God's gift to the gays or about what's going to happen to the gays. At 25, my cousin who moved to Philadelphia, at this time I was still living in Detroit, my cousin who had moved to Philadelphia some years earlier was returning home to die. He was coming home to die of cancer. The only gay cousin that I knew, the only one who I really looked up to because I wanted to know more about this particular person. And so eventually, fast forward many years, I moved to Philadelphia to continue that search, to want to know more about his experience as a black gay man living with this disease, away from his family, but living. Because he always had these fascinating stories about this group of people, these groups of men and women in Philadelphia, about this club called the Now and the Stars, and all these different stories that were fascinating and that didn't seem to go along with all the other narratives that I heard about those people. The funny man at the hair salon, or because this is what everybody in my family always did this, this or this. And I was always one of those kids who always knew that, and so I played with my sexuality, my side note. But to go back to the story, I think that in terms of, and just to bring it back to the film, I matured with HIV and AIDS. And what I mean by that is I felt like I was there at the beginning in terms of seeing the news reports, the early news reports. I remember the Newsweek article in '96 that said that AIDS was over. Like, I remember that clearly. Even in my work as a researcher, I hope that one day there will be. I believe that, I believe I'm going to see the end of this. I believe that I saw the birth of it. I believe that I'll also see the end of it. And I think in terms of our activism, we have to have that kind of belief, at least that kind of optimism, or if we want to see changes come about and take place. When I think about the collection in Philadelphia in terms of our archives on Black LGBT life in Philadelphia, there is a void. And I know that I'm talking mostly about males, and there are more than males who are impacted by this disease. But when I look through the archives, I see those gaps. I see a very full history about gay youth, describing their experiences, and seeing just clippings from newspaper articles and some of our earliest rallies in Philadelphia. And then it jumps all the way to what some of us would call our gay elders, But I'm not seeing, I'm trying to do more to capture that experience of gay adults, particularly the gay adults who lived through this period of time, who were in their 30s and 40s. What were their experiences like dealing with the disease? Were their experiences the same as everyone else? I know enough now to know that there wasn't a single experience. Not everyone had it hard. What I mean by that, some people found ways to deal and cope with having this disease, even if it wasn't talking about it. And that was how they coped and dealt with it. And I think that's a powerful statement for that particular person and those particular people who dealt with it in that sense. There's also the history of struggle, and it was documented here. But within that history and what we see is documented, it's not surprising that there are people who don't know. To me, it's not surprising that that people still have sex without condoms. I think when we think about our conversations about safer sex, or even and thinking about the history of safer sex and this history of this disease, one question that we don't talk about is, why is the exchange of semen important? Even amongst gay men, even amongst gay men who were born after 1983, or even after 1986, when all they maybe heard about were condoms. But semen's important, and it plays a very important role for some men, for many men, including myself. And I think in terms of our conversations, that's one question that I like to see interjected more. It's one question I feel like it, in terms of thinking about the history of HIV and AIDS, that we don't talk about. Why was it important for this person to engage in a sexual act, a very intimate act that they found very loving and very meaningful and it provided connection? You know, I, even as a person who does HIV prevention, I don't talk about risk. I feel like risk is what I do when it's time for me to analyze data. I can then classify you as risky or whatever. But I don't believe that people go out and put themselves at risk. I believe people go out to find intimate connections that sometimes may have consequences. And that consequence may be you might have the best sex you've ever had in your life. That consequence might be 6 months later, you're HIV positive. The consequence might be you fell in love with somebody who you want to spend the rest of your life with. I think all those things are important, and I'm excited to, in terms of collecting history, preserving history, and even exhibiting history, to want to be able to pull out some of those stories that even in the 80s and the 90s and even currently today, you know, as someone who has to talk to research participants, you know, after they found out they've become HIV positive, you know, I try to have those other conversations. You know, not just about these risks that you put yourself in, you know, or place yourself in, but where are the other meaningful connections? And if we can build from there, I don't know, I feel like that's a lesson that we can maybe share with other people. And I hope that with history to be able to bring forth some of those stories.
One of the things I hear in this, Kevin, is, you know, is as somebody who was involved for a very long time in HIV research, that behavioral science, which has been the predominant science around HIV and AIDS, behavioral science, notion of objective behavior as opposed to studying sort of subjective experience. The question of desire and pleasure, they're not part of that vocabulary of the science of behavior. And so they didn't actually emerge into that knowledge base. And, you know, I very quickly learned that the terms of your analysis determine the terms of your intervention. So if your analysis excludes discussions of desire and discussions of subjectivity, discussions of sadness, discussions of emotions, if that's absent from your study, it's going to be absent from your intervention. And you're only going to address the person as the sort of behaving machine in some way. And this idea that these, you know, that these sort of stories actually can return to the discussions of sex and the discussions of the epidemic, these very, very deep notions of longing and of pleasure is I think, a very strong. It reminds me of a point that Douglas Crimp, who has written extensively on the epidemic, makes in a really wonderful paper called Mourning and Militancy. He talks about going to see a film at the Gay and Lesbian Film Festival with somebody who was a generation younger than him. And this film was about sex before AIDS. And it was very explicit. And afterwards, they were having this conversation, and this young man turned to Douglas Crimp and said, I feel sort of incredibly sad about one of the elements of this. And Douglas says, what is it? And he goes, I don't know what cum tastes like. Somebody else's cum, that is. And Douglas says, I felt sad in that moment for him, but for myself, because I do know what it tastes like, right? And those kinds of details, that sense of what actually gets lost in what needs to be mourned, needs to be let go in the process of change, is very enormous. So what I'm hearing in this is, you know, is the labor every day of trying to actually reclaim pleasure, and also the understanding that as historical contexts change, as our times change, so there are going to be certain things that we have to let go of, that there are no longer possibilities for us. And I'd like to, oh, he's gone. I mean, I'd like to just also sort of flag this sort of huge question that, that Bruce sort of introduced. Bruce was talking about being a student at Columbia. This question of these massive historical struggles, the massive historical struggles to actually fundamentally, Leo was also pulling this up, to really create a kind of massive transition in society. He referenced class struggle. One of the things that I notice in this history, one of the things that has happened in AIDS that I don't understand. You had the guys who were writing that pamphlet, that absolutely essential pamphlet, How to Have Sex at an Epidemic, saying we thought of ourselves as feminists. We were feminists. There has been this incredible separation in the AIDS world away from the women's movement, away from feminism. There has also been a separation from this incredible radical struggle within the gay movement around sexuality. And you've seen the kind of normalizing of homosexuality, at least, becoming the public agenda. So now the desire is no longer to create the possibilities for radical sexualities. Now the desire is to get married and to be able to fight in the military. These are the struggles. And the discourse of feminism, which is deeply related, feminism being deeply embedded in the anti-war movements, and also the movements against institutions like marriage, which were seen as patriarchal institutions. That rupture between those movements seems so extraordinary. So this shift is something that I don't understand. So there are these two sort of poles that I'm sort of identifying here. One is the poles of these kinds of ephemeral intimacies, the everyday moments of the experiences of longing, of pleasure and desire, and how these histories, these stories return those to us. And then there are these very, very large movements where alliances that were really transforming the world in fundamental ways and accomplished so much social change that seemed essential to each other in their solidarity, have drifted into these fragmented and often contradictory agendas. So if people can illuminate some of those movements, it would be fantastic. If not, that's okay as well. But I sort of open this now to any sort of follow-up comments or thoughts or reflections or questions.
I think in Philadelphia, I think one of the things that helped dismantle many of the alliances or the identities that people may have had across movements was probably our funding structure for HIV and AIDS. The funding structure. So when our first organizations were funded, they the way they did in Philadelphia and as in some other places, they funded a predominantly white group. They funded a predominantly black group. They funded a predominantly Asian group. You know what? Take out the predominantly. They found a black group to fund. They found a white group to fund. They found an Asian group to fund. Found a Latino group to fund. And then we had one group, which is still a mystery, that came about, and it was a black heterosexual group. And all these groups came after 1991. So you had about 8, 9, 10 years of the epidemic in Philadelphia, in which people were already doing work and probably doing it together in cohesion, building alliances, understanding what resources were available. Once the monies got split up by these racial groups in Philadelphia, I'm just talking about, and this is just my interpretation of what happened in Philadelphia. There was less collaborations. There was more fighting, because then we had to get to the table and figure out, can I have the slice of pie, or can I have the crust, or can I have the whole pie, and why are they getting the cherry, and why is he getting the strawberry, and you bake that in a tin can, and we got it on a rock. I mean, it was, and there were real issues, there were real, very important issues, but I think we, the universal we of Philadelphians, we allowed, we forgot all the great things that we were doing before the government stepped in to give us money. We forgot how to save our own lives. And we knew how to do that by building community, by working in relationship with, you know, with our straight allies, working in, you know, in relationship with women, who provide a lot in Philadelphia. When I look at the clips and see Sister Wahida Shabazz, like, she's incredible. She has, I like to believe that she's done more for the Black gay male community in terms of HIV awareness than many of our Black gay leaders, many of our Black, many just leaders, period. And I'm excited for her legacy and everything she's contributed, but I don't see the connections that fellow Black gay male communities are making to do the work that she's doing. She stepped across outside of an aisle that, you know, people would say, you have this Black Muslim woman coming up in full garb into the gay bars to bring awareness, and you didn't see that. And you know, so I think that's what happened in terms of Philadelphia. This funding structure just really, I think they gave us all blinders when they gave us our fundings with the RFPs and the RFAs. They said, put these blinders on and just keep this tunnel vision. You just need to focus on your community. Don't think about the other communities, just focus on your own community. And I think that was the biggest problem.
Shanti, I'd like to add a sort of thoughts about Hillsborough's protest. And there was the alliance with the anti-globalization movement. And, you know, Anne Christine's work, also rising very much out of the sexual rights and the women's movement, seemed to actually help to give an articulation to the anti-globalization movement that was then able to articulate this critique of global pharmaceutical companies and their manipulation of the market system. And I wonder what your reflection is on the, you know, actually sort of seeing those alliances around those struggles, what the Treatment Action Campaign was able to accomplish in South Africa around those sorts of struggles, what your sense might be now of what the state of those alliances are.
You know, one of the interesting things about thinking about this film in terms of history is that a part of it that seemed very immediate and kind of somebody was saying about living in the future. We thought we were really pointing to the future with this organization called CHAMP that today is their last activity. They had a protest in front of the White House, and they're shutting down because there's just no, there's not enough support. There's not enough support for the kind of work that, because for those of you who don't know, their whole idea, I mean, Julie Davids was in the film and she talked about this kind of cross-generational, different communities. I mean, Wahida started working with CHAMP. It was a national coalition. I found that movement very reminiscent to what was happening around global AIDS and especially around access to treatment. And so it's pretty tragic that piece of the movement that seemed very dynamic when we were filming in, I don't know, 2000, what are we now, 10, even as recently as 2008, I mean, it seemed like things were still kind of on track. But organizations are ephemeral. I mean, I don't think it's just, you know, funding. There's also things that are hard to sustain. There's energy. It's hard to sustain energy for that kind of like radical social change, and it takes a lot of sacrifice. And I think, yeah, it's one of the things. I mean, when you keep paying attention for long enough, you see these things these coalitions kind of coming together and then disbanding. But I don't think, I mean, with this, one of the reasons that we wanted to make this film is to kind of, to go against this idea that I mean, I came to New York about 10 years ago, and I've been surprised. One of my first kind of realizations about New York was that everybody had this kind of idealized vision of ACT UP. Oh, that was when, you know, everything happened, and that's, you know, that's AIDS activism was then. And because I was involved in this global movement for access to medicines, I just thought that was ridiculous. Like, there was this really, you know, vibrant movement happening, and a lot of people in New York were involved in it. Yeah, health gap, but also just, I mean, you know, ACT UP New York was still going, was still meeting, and you know, there was this idea that like ACT UP was over. I mean, it was much smaller, of course, but organizations like GMHC are still, I mean, there is continuity, and there's always, and there is kind of creativity. So I think, you know, rescuing those kinds of, you know, histories of the present and things that are actually happening and that might be ephemeral. I think that's a way of like combating that kind of pessimism about the direction. I don't think things are falling apart. I think that movements have their moments where they're very visible. Right now, there's a whole new kind of alliance happening with students around, you know, pressuring for Obama to keep promises about funding. So I think the questions of identity are definitely ones that we have to keep working on. And in this country, those are, I mean, every social movement has the women's movement, the movement, you know, any social movement is going to have to confront race, because that's just not, people don't work through it in this country. And so I don't think the AIDS movement was kind of an exception in that way. But
I think we're actually kind of way over our time, right? I don't mind that. But you know, maybe we can sort of have like a final comment, and if people do want to stick around, you know, or move somewhere else and continue conversation, that's absolutely cool. But if there are any sort of final reflections that people would like to share at this point. I can give a very long list of things that I think need to be addressed and can be struggled for if anybody's looking for something to do. And I've lived long enough to actually see things change in extraordinary ways, that I think profound change actually is possible. I've become much more hopeful, actually, as I've aged. Any last thought? Well, thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to hearing the stories, hearing these histories told and retold, and to us making the history of the future through our various interventions. Okay, go well.